Welcome back to the Torque Test channel. Has what you just watched in our opening sequence ever happened to you? Chances are, if you've come across one of these hard to access ABS control modules, transmission cooler lines, or even a simple brake bleeder, you've felt the cheeks clenching effect you get when your wrench suddenly lurches forward a bit, buggering one of those butter soft flare nuts and fittings in the process. These are usually made out of soft steel or aluminum to promote a good pressure seal, but that helps you diddly when trying to remove them. That's why today we're investigating the good old-fashioned line wrench. 10 different examples of the 1/2 by 9/16 inch wrench, in fact, most of which were recommended to us by the tool snobs of Garage Journal message board. So if there's a flare nut wrench on the market that can keep your knuckles the least bloody, or your swear jar the most empty, it's probably here. Rumor is the difference between a bad one and a good one is night and day, so we want to quantify that as much as we can. Compared to standard open-end wrenches, flare nut wrenches offer 2 extra corners of engagement on a hex nut, hopefully allowing you a better chance at turning your own torque on a rusty old brake bleeder into unthreading progress. They feature a cutout to allow access onto those hydraulic lines, otherwise, let's face it, we'd be using a box end wrench or sockets if we had the choice. So with 10 different examples and brands to get through, let's dive in order of price. So up first we have the Craftsman Flarenut wrench, which can be the lowest cost set depending on if you're buying Craftsman at Lowe's or online. This is a more modern Craftsman example from the last 5 years, which means made in China. After it arrived and during editing, we noticed it may not be the latest Craftsman sold at Lowe's, though it's hard to keep up, to be honest, and Lowe's website doesn't work for me half the time. Anywho, we're going to first be measuring their hex opening and ranking these examples by their tightest tolerance. On these tools, more than any other, as it's not always the case, smaller, tighter, and less wiggle room is better. By zeroing out the caliper at 1/2 inch, we can see their measurements that are just over 1/2 inch. So that's 0.008 inches for the Craftsman in this case. Up next, we have the Crescent brand, which is the cheapest overall set at $15 for 3 or $5 a piece, also made in China. It's measuring 0.014 inches over 1/2 inch, quite a bit more loosey-goosey in this case. And here we have a new, never used classic raised panel Craftsman. Yes, you know we can't leave an old school Craftsman out like this. The Sears made in the USA Craftsman that built the American DIY wave of the 20th century. Adjusted for inflation, these cost about $7.80 a piece. Are these actually good, or do we just look back on them fondly because we can't have them anymore? Well, its tolerance says 0.013 inches over 1/2 inch, so not the greatest start so far. Next up, we have the Harbor Freight, and no, we're not slumming it with the Pittsburgh line today. Recently, they introduced their Quinn line of flare nut wrenches, our first Taiwan entry of the day, and their better, best strategy on display here. Sold in only a set, these were $40 or $8 a piece. Harbor Freight's Icon line doesn't offer line wrenches, so this is our top game in town, and it's seeing 0.013 inches. Next, we got the Gearwrench, and often compared to hand tool for its affordability and quality, though it's a brand normally known for their Taiwan tools, so our surprise this one showed up as made in China. It does make some sense. Gearwrench is owned by Apex Tools, and Apex Tools does have Chinese factories. $53 a set, $8.83 a piece, and it's measuring 0.012 inches over. Next up in price is technically the Vicegrip 7LW. Nothing to measure here since it's adjustable, but it should help in the coming test to prevent slipping, which is the end goal. Now on to some tool truck pricing levels, starting first with the Matco example, made in Taiwan, $71 a set or $17.70 at list price. This measures 0.008 inches over, so coming back down now. And next up in price is the USA-made SK Tools flare nut wrench. This is the only standard wrench today to be a bit different in length, we found, a bit shorter, but SK is known for being one of the best choices for avoiding rounded nuts and bloody knuckles. A set is about $91 or $18.20 a piece, and it's measuring 0.009 inches over here. And surprisingly, up in price again, we're including another Gearwrench, this time their ratcheting flex head flare nut wrench design. These sell as a set for $95, $19 a piece, due to obviously more complexity, but still again made in China in this case. Nothing to measure here as it moves, we're just including it today because we're curious. This design seems a bit risky and we would never spend our own dollars on trying this out, so you guys are financing that by watching this right now. Thanks for that. Last up, we have the Snap-on made in the USA. She's a pricey one, $52.80 a piece. A $264 set of 5, but this has the reputation of being the top dog If you're done messing around with rounded flare nuts and bleeders, this is the one-stop shop to buy once and cry once sort of arrangement. But no one really knows exactly why. Its measurements of 0.0035 to 0.005 tell the story so far though. That's twite like a toiga. And here's our ranking list where you will be seeing these scores as we tally them. We're on a 10-point scale here. 10 is best, 1 would be terrible. We filled in their 9/16 tolerance measurements here as well. These are not purely ranked 1 through 10 as we tried that first and many of the brands end up matching or getting very close to one another and it skews the results to try to order them sequentially. So the Snap-on gets a 10 here, and then the next closest would be the Matco and Craftsman, but there's some gap in tolerance there and it steps down to 8 points, if you see what I'm talking about. Then pretty evenly spaced, so 7, 6, 5, 4, etc. points awarded. In cases where there are gaps or even worse scores, it drops down more, like here. It's pretty close to a ranking order though. Our first test is meant to be similar to brake bleeders, thinner than trans-cooler flare nuts and lines, so we custom ordered these aluminum nuts, but their threads just failed first on every test. So the next best thing is grade 2 nuts that are soft steel to make them more similar to aluminum fittings that you'll come across. And because we've never seen a pristine bleeder, we put these in a fixture and made these exactly 30% rounded. Pretty much. That is on a 1/2 inch nut, which our measured 0.498 inches. The hex points measured 0.564 across. That's a difference of 0.066 inches. So take 30% off of that difference in the gap there, and that's 0.544 at the hex now. Boom, precision rounded. With the dyno calibrated to turn bolt tension PSI into foot-pounds on this 5/16 24 thread grade 8 bolt and soft nut, we're going to measure how much progress the nut makes before the wrench slips. This has the benefit of ignoring your effort, turning and buggering up the hex nut, and just measuring how much work you're able to accomplish by turning it. Up first, the Craftsman. The Craftsman reached 27 foot-pounds, and the threads on the nut were pretty much done when we took it off, so basically maxed it out. Quite good. The Crescent is next, basically the cheapest you can buy online. Here's a close-up of that. 13 foot-pounds. Not amazing. Next is the vintage Craftsman. And this one was able to max out the threads as well. Top marks. Pretty good. Here's Harbor Freight's Quinn. This was about 12 foot-pounds. Does not like rounded stuff very much. Gearwrench up next. Also 12 foot-pounds. It kind of felt like turning mud. Now for the Vicegrip 7LW designed for this sort of buggered bolt action. If your 1/2 inch nut is no longer really 1/2 inch, it doesn't really care. It adjusts to its size. Also getting maxed out points here. And now here's the Matco Tools. Could tell early on it was going to slip eventually, but it made it to 19 foot-pounds before doing so. And here's SK. SK made it to 20, then didn't make it any further. The ratcheting gear wrench. Oh boy, yeah. They do not like anything that's partially rounded. That cam action lever arm appears to hold on to just hex points, so if they're gone, well, zero torque, at least here. Alright, snap-on time. The snap-on quickly maxed out the bolt, no sweat, but you can tell she was digging in here. Doesn't come away unscathed. And here's an overview of their new scores with the same process, but with our 30% rounded 9/16 grade 2 nuts. recalibrated on the dyno with the torque wrench. The threads last a bit more before failure, which is usually around 35 to 40 foot-pounds now. And the ratcheting gear wrench, still the same luck there. Back to our ranking now, and here's what that looks like. All the tools that maxed out the threads get 10s, and the tools that came close to those torque values get a 9, just 1 in this case. Then if a bit further down of the pecking order, you get 8s, 7s, and 6s, down to some of the lower scores here. So far, the Vicegrip and the Snap-on are batting 1,000, but the Vicegrip's only competing in 2 tests so far. Next up, we have some unmolested hex nuts, fresh out of the bag, but these are coupling nuts, rated grade A, basically as soft as you can commercially sell a steel nut. These are basically for like curtain rods and closets. The benefit here is the internal thread size is now larger compared to its outside hex than our standard nuts, so larger bolt means all of the threads survive in these next 1/2 inch and 9/16 tests, only up to the wrenches to rank themselves now due to slipping. And we weren't super happy with the small amount of resolution we were getting when converting to foot-pounds, so we're going to be leaving the display in bolt tension PSI from now on. For your reference, the divider is by 15.5 for 1/2 inch tests and 10.5 for 9/16 inch tests, as shown with the torque wrench here. We're going to be measuring the point just as the wrench slips, as additional torque generated by marring the nut is not super useful to rank with. Here's a 9/16 side-by-side of newer versus older Craftsman Raised Panel. Just 324 PSI from the Raised Panel, and a whole 598 from the newer. 1/2 inch is a similar story, 402 versus 676. That's about 26 versus 44 foot-pounds. Moving on to the 1/2 inch Crescent, it reaches 659 PSI, or about 43 foot-pounds. And its 9/16 wrench end moves into first place with 689 PSI, which is about 66 foot-pounds for 9/16. Harbor Freight Quinn tallies up to 495 and 1/2 inch. And its 9/16, 549 for the same ranking position. Gearwrench's turn in 1/2 inch. About the same as Quinn at 507, and its 9/16 moves into second with 615 PSI. Besides you being limited by space to fit this sort of Vicegrip tool, we're also limited in extra leverage. We were able to budge this tool up to 628 and 1/2 inch, but it's getting a bonus point in the ranking for not slipping at all here. And same deal with 9/16, just was not slipping off of that soft nut. Matco's turn here in 1/2 inch. It jumps into the lead with 741 PSI for this size, and also 9/16 with 705. And here's SK. Also super impressive in 1/2 inch with 702, and its 9/16 does well, but a little bit lower in comparison with 610. The ratcheting gear wrench found something it likes and takes this 1/2 inch coupling nut to 436. As shown here, we found that a simple open-end wrench can even make a little bit more progress than that. In 9/16 though, it does build some steam, 680 or so before repositioning the tool, where it found some rounded spots it didn't like. And here's the snap-on. $681 for 1/3 and 1/2 inch. Was surprised to see that. But in 9/16, let's see. $925. So this is how things rank before we head over to our last testing series. Snap-on gets something other than a 10 for once, an 8 here, surpassed by SK and Matco in 1/2 inch. Then the same old story over here with Snap-on being enough out ahead that there is no 9 again. The ratcheting gear wrench did poor in 1/2 inch and pretty well in 9/16. The vintage Craftsmen seem to like working on rounded stuff more than these new nuts, very weird. And the Vicegrip scored 6s here, but got bumped up to 7s due to never actually slipping. Not sure how else to score those like the others. It certainly got pros and cons, takes up some space to lock onto that Flarenut, a lot more to even turn it, but she grips, no rips. Our last test series before we look at hardness, and that won't be ranked, is ASME Proof Torque. Per ASME standard B107.100, section 40 and 66, you use a hex mandrel and torque on these things until they cam out of position or the tool fails. So we'll be using these tool steel hard as nails hex bit sockets with the torque wrench. We're interested to see after some use what these wrenches can bring, as we're assuming you don't toss out a wrench each and every time one slips on a fastener. And this gives us a chance to measure some reverse action. Craftsman 1/2 inch is up first, and we saw 54.6 before camming out. Here's vintage Craftsman, 57.3, so it's moving into the lead. Crescent now.
Crescent.
A full 78.7 foot-pounds. That's pretty up there.
78.7.
Harbor Freight Quinn.
Harbor Freight.
58.8.
58.8. Gearwrench.
Gearwrench moves into the lead with 85.8. On hard stuff, the Vicegrips slip rather than digging into that fastener, and it gets 62.4 foot-pounds.
Matco.
And the Matco saw as high as 58.4 in 1/2 inch.
58.4. SK.
Here's SK. 91.2, super up there in torque for a 1/2 inch nut.
Gearwrench.
Once we got the ratcheting gear wrench to bite, it saw only 30.7 foot-pounds before slipping.
Snap on.
And here's the snap-on. It ties SK with 90.7. That's going to max out the points for sure. And now on to 9/16 for some bigger numbers. Craftsman sees 81.6.
81.6.
The vintage sees 71.3.
71.3.
Crescent 75.6. Harbor Freight Quinn was the first angle we shot, and noticed we didn't fit everything on screen, but 46.7 here. Still pretty low.
46.7.
Gearwrench sees as high as 69.4.
69.4.
The Vicegrip appreciates the larger size to grip onto and gets 86.8. Matco moves way up there with 89.2 and goes into the lead.
89.2.
SK does decent, but shears off in the process, drawing a small amount of blood as well. The ratcheting actually likes this size and moves way up compared to its 1/2 inch scores.
96.8.
And finally, the snap-on. Which maxed out this wrench. Ultimately wasn't able to improve upon that score, but it still takes top honors there.
100.1.
On the ranking, that makes for a couple more 10s here for the old Snappy. A 10 and a 5 for SK, whose 9/16 broke off, grouping it with the Gearwrench and vintage Craftsman. The huge disparity of the ratcheting designs from two sizes here, and the only other traditional wrench brand to reach near snap-on in the second test being Matco. Now for the hardnesses before we total and average these points. Enter our $2,000 hardness tester. The rule with this guy is each time you see it on screen, and if you're still watching, you have to check to see if you're subscribed, which if you're not, well, that's perfectly fine too, but if you thought you were and you aren't, well, there you go. All right, ASME hardness specs for wrenches of these categories is 38 to 55 HRC, pretty wide range. Hardness alone doesn't determine toughness, and harder isn't always better unless you're asking my wife. Ask SK though, breaking off completely is probably not preferred. We ground down into the wrench ends of these tools, and for the Craftsman we saw 46.8 HRC on the average. For the vintage it was 47.4, about the same. Crescent's wrenches were lower at 43.4. Harbor Freight 45. Gearwrench saw the lowest on the day at 43 flat. Matco sees another 45. SK 48.5, so stepping things up. The Ratcheting Gearwrench 46.6. And Snap-on 51.2. Yes, after several checks, by far the hardest wrench. Not something you can often get away with without fracturing, but seeing as it's so different in its results and performance today, it must be part of the puzzle to its success. The Vicegrip also saw 51.5, but a different category of tools. Those jaws need to be hard to bite into things. You hearing this, brands? We're giving you the keys to the city here. A harder wrench made out of a good alloy steel like chromoly that can be tough at those hardness levels. Enough meat on the end to prevent fracturing under load, and a tight tolerance. I mean, brands, please feel free to copy this formula for all the guys out there who don't have a tool truck or want to spend $264 on a small set. Let's total these findings though and see where everyone falls. These scores are added up and averaged out to even them for the few wrenches that couldn't compete in all the categories. That's 7.38 points for the Craftsman, a 5 for the Crescent, also an identical 5 for the vintage Craftsman. Did we just get a bad unused one, or are your experiences similar? I still use my grandfather's Craftsman stuff somewhat often. Oh well, the rank chart doesn't really care. Harbor Freight 3.88. Ouch. I guess not much of a step up from the Pittsburgh ones. They do look good though, and they're from Taiwan. It's a bit weird. 5.5 for Gearwrench. 8 for the Vicegrips, and we'll touch on that in a moment, why that's sort of both fair and unfair at the same time. 7.63 for the Matco, 7.88 for SK, 3.5 for the Ratcheting, oof, and 9.78 for Snap-on. Needless to say, Snap-on is top and first, followed by the Vicegrips, USA-made SK, Taiwan-made Matco, then China-made Craftsman, followed by Gearwrench, Vintage Craftsman, and Crescent, then the Ratcheting Gearwrench, which we only included because we thought it was sort of a bad idea to begin with. And we have to say, despite a few flashes of brilliance, yeah, no, please don't reinvent the wheel on an already nut-rounding category of wrenches and nuts. Please. The Vicegrips have the advantage of not having to compete here, and also being sort of big overall with worse access and difficulty repositioning that onto the nut after you do turn it a little. But it's also the only one to have basically never slipped on any of the nuts we tried, and it got an extra point in each case for it. We would absolutely recommend having a pair of these handy when you need them for ugly looking fittings, bleeders, and nuts. After all, nuts, when you come across them, are rarely exactly 14 millimeters anyways. So this will help with that. As for a set to have in your toolbox, well, yeah, Snap-on if you can swing it. Or SK and Matco. We noticed SK wrenches sold individually are similar price, or sometimes less buying it that way versus buying the set. So pick up the ones you need and leave the rest. That's what I'd be doing. What were your thoughts and surprises? Leave them down below. This one grew in scope quick, so took us some time to cover, sorry about that. 10 tools, 10 different tests, often on 2 cameras, 170 different video clips we shot. Let us know if you want to see some other types of wrenches tested, more concisely and shorter hopefully. Till then, check out Client Graphics channel. He does amazing stuff on this type of content with better equipment than us. Click subscribe to follow along, and thanks for watching.